Excellent. Good afternoon. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second community session of the UN 75 Global Governance Forum entitled Global Cooperation in the Face of Increasing Ecological Threats. My name is Michael Collins. I'm the Executive Director for the Institute for Economics and Peace, also known by its acronym IEP. I'm joined today by Steve Killalay, IEP's Executive Chairman, who's going to kick off today's session by presenting key findings from the Ecological Threat Register. This is a recently published IEP report that quantitatively compares countries' exposure to future ecological threats with their existing level of resilience. So the aim of the report is to identify countries most at risk and in the context of today's conversation, inform sovereign and multilateral resilience building efforts worldwide. So we have the honor of being joined today by three distinguished guests that are going to help us sort of delve more deeply into this subject. Sharon Burke, Senior Advisor for the International Security Program and Resource Security Program at New America. Sharon is former US Assistant Secretary of Defense for Operational Energy Plans and Programs, as well as Germán Rosa Chavez, consultant, researcher, and former Minister of the Environment and Natural Resources of El Salvador, and Claudia Martinez, Executive Director of Economía, Ecología y Ética Asesorías, and former Deputy Minister of the Environment of Colombia. After Steve's presentation, our guests are going to be giving 5 minutes of commentary each, after which we'll move to an extended question and answer session. Now, Q&A is no fun. In fact, there's no Q&A at all without audience participation. So we welcome you to submit questions at any time during the presentation using the Q&A feature on Zoom. Our guests are, of course, welcome to ask each other questions at that time too. So thank you very much, everybody, for being here. Let's begin. Steve, I'd like you to share a bit more about the Institute, key findings for the report, and your preliminary thoughts on global cooperation in the face of future ecological threats.
Great, okay. Thanks for the introduction, Michael. Just to share the screen now, I'll get that up and we'll get underway. Right, so this is the inaugural release of the Ecological Threat Register. We launched it last week, and in the first 5 days, we ended up with about 3 billion media impressions globally from some 250 articles. It was featured on BBC World News, Euro News, Reuters carried and was on the front page of CNN, just to name some. So I've got a lot of interest and a lot of attention. And the things which got the attention I'll move through in this presentation. Presentation will take about 20 minutes. It's fairly fast moving, and that's so we can get in and hear from the other speakers and then move into the questions as Michael suggested. So just a little bit of background on the Institute for Economics and Peace first. Work's used extensively by many organisations, including the OECD, Commonwealth Secretariat, World Bank, United Nations. Work's also included in thousands of university courses around the world. And in any one year, we get over 500,000 downline loads of our reports. That's just off our website, doesn't account for what gets downloaded from other websites. We know that's even larger than this figure. Got about 16 billion media impressions last year. That was from about 150 countries, published 10 reports, and our websites got about 1.3 million unique visitors. We're situated in 6 different countries, headquartered in Sydney, Australia, offices in New York, which Michael runs, Brussels, The Hague, Mexico City, and Harare. So it's a combination of being in a lot of the major geopolitical centres, but also offices in some of the more stressed countries, which gives us the opportunity to be able to build up information from the ground. So now let's look at the Ecological Threat Register. This is the inaugural edition. This is the first one we've put out. And what we're going to be doing is releasing this, much like we do with the Global Peace Index, the Global Terrorism Index, release it each year. So the next one will build on what we've got in this one. Covers 157 countries. That's about 97% of the world's population. So we looked at the area which was most missing, which could be affected by climate change, would be the Pacific Islands. The report covers 8 areas of ecological risk. food, water, population growth, droughts, floods, sea levels, cyclones, and rising temperatures. Food and water and population growth come together to form a nexus, which we'll see come through in really creating conflict traps. We'll see how that develops a little bit further on. And the report's developed by the Institute for Economics and Peace, but for a lot of the data on food, water, population growth, etc., we relied on some of the best experts in the world to supply that data. What the Institute has, which is original, is the understanding of conflict, and also measures resilience, societal resilience, because when hit by a shock, depending on the resilience of the society, it'll determine whether it can cope with it or whether the society implodes. And we use IEP's positive peace framework as the measure of resilience. And we also project out to 2050. Some of it's to 2040, but mainly projected out to 2050, so that we can get some idea of what the future may look like. All right, let's move into the key findings. So what we found was that 141 countries had at least one ecological threat. That means 16 countries do not. What was quite remarkable was 19 of the countries, the most threats, are home to 2.1 billion. But 10 of those countries are amongst the least peaceful countries on the Global Peace Index. In fact, four of the 5 least peaceful countries in the world are in that 10, which comes back and explains and just highlights that the nexus between a conflict and resource scarcity. 6.4 billion people live in countries who are exposed to medium to high ecological threats. That doesn't mean they won't cope, but it means it's there. So Australia, for example, is exposed to 3 ecological threats. When we look at the 19 countries which are exposed to ecological threats, that's 4 or more. Afghanistan at 6 has the largest number of ecological threats. There are 3 clusters of ecological hotspots, which we think are likely to suffer from collapse. The first is the Sahel Horn Belt. That's from Mauritania to Somalia. There's the Southern African Belt, which is Angola to Madagascar, which includes Zimbabwe and Zambia. Then there's another belt running from the Middle East, which is from Syria, running through to Pakistan. So they're the 3, what we'd see as the ecological hotspots. And in this, an ecological hotspot is where you've got 3 or more ecological threats. Now, what was really quite startling, we looked at the 10 countries which were receiving the most climate aid through ODAs. Only 2 of them were amongst the countries which we saw as at the most risk. So and there's good reason for that. We will come back to that later. What also come out of this is we believe there'll be migration routes, and we see 3 of them. One's from Latin America to the US and to Canada. Although Latin America has not got a lot of ecological threats, there are a couple of areas such as Venezuela which have very, very low resilience, which we believe could fuel migration up that way. So the others, obviously Sahel and Sub-Saharan Africa to Europe. The others, South Asia and the Middle East, also leading towards Europe. When we look at it, we take low resilience. We look at the really major ecological threats. We find that 1.2 billion people live in these countries. That's 32 countries. And what we believe, that's the number of people who are using this methodology at risk of displacement by 2050. What I want to make clear, however, even without climate change, these ecological threats are very, very real, particularly for food and water. And we'll had a little bit more of that earlier on. So let's just look at the way we calculate that 1.2 billion. So we divide it up into 2 baskets. The first basket is what we call resource risk. That consists of water, food, population growth. There's 740 million people living in the country, in that group of countries. Then we've got natural disasters. That covers things like floods, cyclones, drought, temperature increases, and there's 1 billion people living in that group. And together, they total 43 countries. What we do then is compare the 2 lists, drop any duplicates which there may be, And that leaves 32 countries which are left, which have 1.2 billion population at risk of being displaced, which is the population of those countries. So these are big numbers, but this doesn't include places like India, for example, which we believe, because it's a medium peace country, which we believe could be at the risk of ecological collapse as well in some areas. One of the things which came out of this, which I think for me was pretty stark and is really making me think now, is the relationship between conflict and resource degradation. So what we're thinking is there's been this vicious cycle, which is probably maybe in some of these places maybe going on for a century, where you've got resource degradation that leads to a conflict within the society. That conflict then leads back to further resource degradation. So if we're looking at some of these countries which are got the most threats, we're looking at countries like Iraq, we're looking at countries like Syria, and Yemen. And so we can see that there's just the countries quite often in the worst conflicts are actually also caught in these resource degradation and the ecological hotspots. So, and that's back to 10 of the 19 countries facing shocks are in conflict, very conflict zones, and 4 of the 5 least peaceful countries in the world are ones at most risk. So what we see here is a vicious cycle. As the resources degrade, leads to conflict. The conflict leads to further resource degradation, and on the process goes from there. So I think one of the things we can see, there's a need to be able to tackle some of these resource shortages if we want to stop future conflict. And so this gives you an idea of a map of the world. Dark red is where the biggest threats with the least resilience lie. 3 migration paths out of this, 1 to Europe, 2 up to Europe and 1 into the US. So now if we just look at the countries, and I won't spend long on this, Afghanistan has the most threats at 6, and we can see the history of conflict there. You've got Mozambique, it's another country which gets mired in conflict, Namibia, and if you look through this list, you've got places like Chad, you've got Iran, you've got Iraq, Kenya, Pakistan, Syria, Uganda, Zimbabwe. So you can see there is this strong relationship between conflict, low resilience, and ecological threat. So another way of being able to look at this is what's the distribution of ecological threats. As I mentioned earlier on, Afghanistan with the dark colour here is the one with the 6 ecological threats, which are the most. This gives you an idea of the way it's scattered throughout the world. So Australia and the US, for example, have 3 ecological threats. You can see that Latin America is in not too bad shape. All right, let's move down and have a quick look at resilience. Positive peace we use as the measure of resilience. And what's interesting, over the last decade, roughly 3 out of every 4 countries have improved its levels of positive peace. So that's probably contrary to what a lot of people are thinking. So positive peace consists of 3 parts: attitudes, institutions, and structures. Institutions and structures domains have improved, but the attitudes domains actually come off. So positive peace is also associated with a whole lot of other things we consider desirable. So strong statistical connections with positive peace, higher per capita income, better ecological performance, higher measures of well-being, and better measures on inclusion. Now, so what that means is, and these are the things which actually create the resilience, and I won't go into detail on that because that's a whole nother subject. But also, positive peace is a very good predictor of substantial falls in future peace. So we can look out 5 to 7 years and get about a 60% accuracy rate using positive peace on major falls in peace. So now, these are just the resource scarcity hotspots, 746 million people. You'll notice what we do is we've got what the stressor is, the positive peace status, whether they're deteriorating or improving. So the ones which we would really need to watch, the ones with the larger population, very low positive peace, and ones which are deteriorating. They're the countries which are in real strife. So obviously their countries in this case are things like Yemen, Mozambique, Central African Republic, Eritrea, Haiti, Syria, to name some. So now if we move on, we now look at the natural disasters. We'll see quite a strong overlap with this group and the prior group, but not a total overlap. So there's about a 50% overlap between the two different domains. Again, we can see countries like Mozambique through drought, Iran through floods, which, contrary to what a lot of people may think, you got Mali, Mauritania also. That totaled to about just over 1 billion people. So let's dig a little bit more into resource scarcity. So one of the things we see is population growth, and particularly for sub-Saharan Africa, this is going to be a real problem. It's projected to reach 10 billion in 2050. After that, there are different models which show that population may start to decrease. But by 2050, the 40 least peaceful countries in the world will be home to about 1.3 billion more people. In fact, what we're going to find is in the bottom quartile of the Global Peace Index, we home to half the world's population. 17 countries, they're all in sub-Saharan Africa, are projected to double their populations by 2050. And this is obviously the fastest growing region in the world. Niger will be the one which has the biggest increase. That'll increase by 171%. But these population growths are already in the countries which are highly stressed. And so if we look at the green lines at the bottom, they're very highly peaceful countries. The very high peace countries, like particularly in the Europe, let's say, Western Europe, it's estimated that populations will decrease by about 2%. But if we look at the very low peace countries, we can see just how rapid the population growth is going to be there, and has been. And what that does is it highlights that these are also quite often the countries with the lowest resilience, and they're also the countries with the highest number of ecological threats. So if we look at water stress, 2.6 billion people are going to be living in 46 countries which have higher extreme water stress. High water stress is more than 40% of the available fresh waters used in any one year. Extreme water stress is when it's more than 80%. So you start to put some of these population projections in this, and you can see how dire the future could be. This is startling stat. There are now 60% less fresh water available per person than what there was 60 years ago. So now, by 2040, we estimate that about half the world, 5.4 billion people in 59 countries, will experience higher extreme water stress. That includes India and China. They'll have high water stress, which is more than the 40% usage. What we've also seen over the last decade is the number of water-related conflicts has increased. In fact, they're up by 270%. The area, the two countries where we've seen the most incidences are Yemen and Iraq. And again, it comes back and highlights this relationship between conflict and resource scarcity. So now, all we can see is that the combined effects of, let's say, climate change are only going to increase the effects of what we can see here. So, and again, this will give you an idea of the usage of fresh water and the way it's been going. You can see about the 1960s that the rate has taken off. We're increasing our usage of water globally by about 1% per annum, which is much faster than the population growth. Now let's have a quick look at food. Food insecurity means not having enough food for a healthy life. Now that can be irregular, could be intermittent, and there's the other measures which are worse than that, but we've used food insecurity as the major measure in this. And we estimate that 2 billion people today face food insecurity. That figure is going to jump by 1.5 billion in the next 3 years. So food consumption is expected to increase by 50% between now and 2050. That's mainly fueled by the rising incomes in Asia and the rising middle class in China. So 58% of sub-Saharan countries face food insecurity. That's the highest of anywhere in the world. But if we look at the 13 countries, which are the least peaceful and with low incomes, over 65% of the population in each of these countries suffers from issues regarding the affordability of food. So food will be a major issue going forward. And just to highlight it, we look from 2014 to 2018, we can see that the number of people who are food insecure has increased. Looking at the coronavirus in 2020, that can only get worse. We wouldn't expect it to improve in 2021 either. So let's have a quick look at natural disasters, and we've got about 3 more slides and we'll be done. So if we're looking at 1 billion people live in areas that have high frequency and intensity of natural disasters combined with low or stagnant positive peace. 72% of these natural disasters are floods or storms. And what we found is that in 2019, there was 25 million people were displaced. Now, we read a lot about armed conflict. This was 3 times higher than the number of people who were displaced by armed conflict in that same year. And we've looked at about a 2.1 metre sea level rise. Obviously, that's projecting beyond 2050, but that would cover land which is currently home to about 200 million people around the world, and that's ignoring the Pacific Islands. All right, we're getting down towards the end of it. So now, one of the more interesting things is we've had the climate-related aid. So the climate-related aid has actually increased 34 times in the last decade. Now, a lot of that is the reclassification of aid. But if we looked at overseas developmental aid, other than China, in the last 5 years, all countries have decreased their levels of overseas aid. One of the biggest is the US at 40%. China's increased by 4%, and it's the only one to have increased. But and obviously you can see why India, Indonesia and Bangladesh are picked for a lot of the aid, because they're very big countries. But when we look at that list of countries which we defined earlier on, those 32 countries, only 2 of them are on this list here. So in fact, out of 3 of the 22 most vulnerable countries are on this list. And that, my friends, is the end of the presentation. Back to you, Michael.
Excellent. Thank you, Steve. Given the breadth of what you've spoken about, I'll assume there'll be lots of questions. In fact, some questions have already come in. And as before, I invite the audience to submit questions as and when they come up. You know, your presentation also really sort of gave us a much better picture of some of the challenges ahead, both, you know, for nation states and for multilateral cooperation. So with that, I'd love to hand it over to our esteemed guests, starting with Sharon. Sharon, your research focuses natural security, or the intersection of national security, prosperity, and natural resources. Now, when we talk about global cooperation, it makes sense to start at the nation state, right? Specifically, you know, what is in the national interest, and sort of what are the factors that drive states towards or away from global collaboration. So without trying to sort of pin you down too much, I welcome your thoughts on that matter.
Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you, Steve, for that great presentation. And before I jump into the multilateral piece, I just want to say, I think it's really important that we have this conversation about redefining security and adding all of these different considerations together and how they're linked. And one of the reasons is that what we can do now with a product like this is provide governments with concepts and tools, new governance concepts and tools that embrace complexity. And we have to do that because we're entering a time of trade-offs and prioritization that's going to be fairly ruthless, and we need this kind of data and consideration to guide it. So as well as I think the concept of positive peace, I noticed that in the report at one point you said, for example, which is consistent with our research, that deaths from disasters have fallen even as disasters have gotten worse. And it's just, again, a data point, a proof point that governance and positive peace matter, even in the face of overwhelming challenges. And that's, you know, where the multilateral issue comes in. One of the reasons I think it's so important to redefine security is, you know, think about which multilateral collaborations are particularly effective, and they're often security alliances, the UN Security Council itself, NATO. These things that are organized around security tend to be very effective. Now we need them to either be remodeled to consider a broader definition of security, the one that we've been hearing about today, or we need new alliances that can embrace that broader definition. Second, it's not lost on anyone, I'm sure, that my country has adopted, or our president has adopted, the slogan of America First. Now, that's a little bit rude, for sure, to put it that way, particularly depending on what your goal is, if you're not just reaching to a domestic audience, but it's not untrue. Every country puts its own people first. That's the way it's supposed to work. But there's another half to that slogan, which is what's next, right? No country stands alone, and borders do not contain threats, and they do not contain opportunities. So multilateral alliances are crucial to balancing that tension between your own people and putting them first and what we accomplish together, because we can't advance our own people's interests without doing this together. I also think that the multilateral instruments are really important going forward, because we are in an era now where the competition between the United States and China, and also with Russia, is going on a particularly bad path and increasingly adversarial and towards war. And what we need now is more confidence building. And this approach of ecological threats, I think, can create that means of confidence building. These are not dangers that any one nation can solve alone, even within their own borders. Again, Steve laid out a very compelling vision about migration and other and ecological threats themselves that don't stay contained. So there's an opportunity here for confidence building between these countries, and a way for them to collaborate on addressing common challenges, no matter what else is happening in the relationship. So I think that's a very important thing. I also think that one thing that this product really underscores that is an important consideration in the multilateral framework is the importance of better data and information. That is a key enabler for action. If we don't understand these challenges well enough to put specific investments against them, and to prioritize, then we don't get the best results. So we need better data, we need better research, we need better understanding of exactly how all of these factors influence each other in order to empower that kind of multilateral collaboration. And that's especially true when you start bringing in other players, because it's not just nation states, it's also at the subnational level. Cities are increasingly collaborating on climate change and other ecological threats, the private sector, NGOs. It has to be a platform of shared information and shared data that can guide that kind of collaboration. And again, the nature of the threats are such that that you can only address them in cooperation with other countries. And just one last comment about that is that, not all of these threats that you portrayed are going to affect countries equally, even if they're right next to each other and they're facing the same drought or the same flood. And the bottom line there is that positive peace element is governance. And governance is going to determine how well we handle this rising threat environment. And that emphasis on governance, again, refracts through the multilateral arena, and because these things do not stay contained. So thank you for the opportunity to comment. It's a really interesting report, and I appreciated your presentation, Steve.
Thank you.
That's excellent, Sharon. Thank you very much for touching on so many of those items and bringing it together so much better than I would have been able to. So thank you. And yes, and if the ecological threat register can help move that conversation forward, something that you particularly talked about was entering this time of trade-off, right? And it's so right. And if there is a silver lining to a lot of the challenges that were happening right now, let's hope that it is that sort of incentive, that momentum to actually work very deliberatively in this area. Thank you. Claudia, your experience includes national, regional, and global resilience and climate change initiatives of essentially all kinds. Among many other things, you're currently Columbia Chair for the Food and Land Use Coalition, FOLU. So I'm aware of the call to action that FOLU that Follow issued to world leaders recently. If I can, I'd like you to sort of, to comment on some of the challenges and opportunities of trying to sort of implement these kind of initiatives globally, and whether you're seeing sort of more interest generally, especially in the light of things like COVID-19 and the rising number of ecological threats that Steve outlined today.
Sure, Michael, Steve, thank you for the invitation and for an awesome report. I truly enjoyed the presentation and the relationships between the ecological threats and security, which, we never see it so clearly. In terms of Follow, I want to say that, the case for food systems, food and land use systems is key to the world. As you just mentioned, it drives to all the Sustainable Development Goals. We have 2 billion hectares of agricultural land degraded. We have 62 of the IUCN globally threatened species and adversely affected by agriculture. We have 80% of large marine ecosystems subject to significant eutrophication. And as you know, Follow contributes to 30% of the greenhouse gas emissions. And then, as you just mentioned, in terms of food loss and waste, we're wasting about 1/3 of what we produced. And then we have 820 million people hungry every day. We have 2 billion people overweight or obese. So we have that absurd relationship, of malnutrition and people being hungry. And yet we have a lot of relationships with women and gender issues. 43% of the agricultural workforce are women, and agricultural accounts for 70% of the freshwater withdrawals. So again, I'm just mentioning some data, the one you already mentioned, but that's precisely what we're trying to focus in the Food and Land Use Coalition in the world, where we're trying to sort of see the way to support food security for the world in a way that we don't destroy the planet, but on the contrary, we sort of transform food systems into powerful engines of growth and recovery. In light of that, we did sort of the hidden costs of the food systems today. And what is amazing is that the hidden cost of global food and land use systems sum to 12 trillion compared to the market value of the global food systems of 10 trillion. So in a sense, the food systems cost more to the world than that way they produce. And that's related to issues like health, environment, economics, and also food systems in terms of, for example, food loss and waste. Again, you didn't mention health in your report, but I think that's also crucial, because when you have unhealthy ecosystems, you also have unhealthy societies, and that drives conflict. Now, in that relationship, we're jumping into developing sort of, we did our report, Growing Better, and we came up with 10 critical transitions. And we think that, first of all, we need to think about stronger rural livelihoods. We think that digital revolution would sort of unite us all in a clear way. We obviously know the issues about demography and gender, but how to see the relationship and the opportunity for all is crucial, because you just pointed out the inequality of the world, the difference in the countries, and we need to highlight who is better and who is worse, and how could we do stronger rural livelihoods, because that's where the conflict arises. We obviously need to do wider choices of supply of food, wider choices of diversifying protein supply. We need to reduce food loss and waste, and we also need to do small linkages, loops and linkages to drive markets, consumer producers, and make the world more linkage to these rural realities and rural production systems. And we obviously need to come back to thinking about nature-based solutions, where we sort of regenerate agriculture activities, be more productive. We need to regenerate agriculture, we need to regenerate ecosystems, and we need to regenerate societies. And that has linkages. That has linkages between production and protection. And we need obviously to think about restoring nature. the world in many and different reports, as the one you just mentioned, is thinking about how to reverse the trends and how to come back to a world that is at least 50% protected in order to have the productive area in the other 50% with a more crucial relationship. And that brings also to the need of thinking about oceans and healthy and productive oceans where we might find the proteins of the future. So I think that's another element to this approach, because the world is a lot of oceans and a lot water systems. You pointed out water and water scarcity, but when you also think about the oceans at large, I think it brings another element to the equation. And obviously, if you go up in the pyramid, you want to have healthy diets and you want to have nutritious food. So in a way, food systems and land use tackle most of the areas that you pointed out. Now, I come from a country that is in conflict. I'm from Colombia myself. And obviously, when you showed all these images, I thought, this makes a lot of sense. In Colombia, we signed the peace agreement in 2016, and we're actually helping the Truth Commission to understand the relationship between conflict and the environment. And we have thought that environment and conflict has three types of relationships. First, we see nature as a victim of the conflict. Second, we see nature as a beneficiary of the conflict. In many areas of Colombia, for example, because of the conflict, we had areas like the Amazon that were preserved for many years. As soon as we signed the peace agreement, deforestation was rampant. So you always think about these relationships as well. And then you also see nature as an income generator for insurgent groups. So it's like nature as a way to sort of promote conflict in a sense. So those three types of relationships is also the need. We also need to analyze how to tackle them because they're all related to your presentation and to the way we look forward to a vision of change where conflict, environment, food systems in general are integrated, and we want to forge peaceful societies that are, in peace with nature and with people. So I really appreciate your report. I think it complements amazingly sort of the way to see food systems with a conflict angle and how to approach also globalization, how to approach cooperation. You just mentioned that maybe some of the international cooperation is not going to the countries which are most in conflict and most ecological threatened. And I think we have to rethink that relationship to come up with a global world where we all feel comfortable and in peace. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak about it.
Thank you very much, Claudia. That was great, and I loved how you brought in kind of sort of the example of Colombia to sort of describe very concretely the nexus between conflict and the environment, but also the comments that you had before, bringing in the elements of health and economics as well. One of the things that I loved about the letter that followed Develop for World Leaders was actually sort of the simplicity of the messaging. Ultimately, it was three very basic recommendations, but that was the beauty of it. How well are we doing as a society in kind of sort of demonstrating the return on investment of better use of land with regards to food and water?
Well, I think that's a crucial issue. For example, if you're only going to tackle food loss and waste, you wouldn't be able to sort of produce food in an area as big as the United States. So land use is crucial. The relationship between nature and how we use the food systems is crucial as well. So I think in a nutshell, these critical transitions make you think about how to change food systems, how to change the way we use the land, and how to imagine a world where we have sort of a price of investing in healthy diets, a prize in investing in productive and regenerative agriculture, a prize for protecting and restoring nature, a prize for diversifying protein supply, for reducing food loss and waste, for local loops and linkages, for harnessing the digital revolution, for stronger rural livelihoods, and for gender and demography. And if you add all that, we have thought that there is an economic prize in the next 10 years, and there is also a business opportunity to forge this new sort of economic vision for the world. And it's all related to land use.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Claudia. Much appreciated. Germán, as Minister of the Environment, you very closely tracked increasing ecological stresses in El Salvador, and I know that you have a sort of a great respect for data-driven adaptation programs. When we spoke, you talked about sort of specific measures taken by the country in terms of land use and trying to reduce water stress, and you also talked about how environmental challenges differ vastly between countries and even regions within a specific country. So I'd love for you to expand on that a bit if you can, and I'd be especially interested in sort of the policy implications related to this nationally and internationally.
Well, thank you, Michael and Steve, for this most compelling report. I will focus my comment on how landscape restoration can help in addressing some of the ecological threats highlighted in the report, based on what we have learned in El Salvador over the past decade with our landscape restoration initiative. As you know, El Salvador is the smallest non-island state in the Americas. It's on the Pacific side of the Central American isthmus that straddles the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans, and therefore it can be affected from tropical cyclones generated on both oceans. While El Salvador is shielded somewhat from Atlantic cyclones by Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua, it is completely unprotected from Pacific cyclones when they come close by. This did not happen in earlier decades. We registered our first Pacific hurricane striking El Salvador in 1982, Hurricane Paul. This hurricane triggered a landslide that buried hundreds of families in San Salvador. After Paul, out of the 4 most destructive extreme events that impacted El Salvador, 3 came from the Pacific. And this occurred in 2009, 2010, and 2011, coinciding with the first 3 years of my tenure as minister. These 3 successive extreme events left more than 240 people dead, damaged food and commercial crops, as well as key infrastructure. They destroyed 32 bridges and damaged more than 100 other bridges, as well as more than 1,400 schools, more than 300 public health clinics, and 19 hospitals. In the end, economic loss and damage from just these 3 events was equivalent to 6% of GDP. Our initial response was to strengthen the observation of natural hazards. We put together a world-class multi-hazard monitoring center, which is fed in real time with meteorological, hydrological, seismic, volcanologic, oceanographic, as well as soil and leaf moisture data, which is key for early warning for drought. This system is fully integrated, departing from the tradition in most countries of having separate monitoring service for each natural hazard. The system obviously is a key component of our national civil protection system. Nevertheless, to build resilience, we had to address the extensive land degradation on most of our watersheds. Since lack of infiltrations during heavy storms quickly translates into flooding and infrastructure destroying water surges in rivers, it also reduces aquifer recharge and base water flows leading to severe water scarcity in the dry season. Further, with little soil water retention, crops quickly shrivel during wet season dry spells and can lead to food insecurity when those dry spells turn into actual drought, as was the case in almost every year since 2012. To respond to this situation, in 2012, we launched a national landscape restoration program, which, unlike other programs that focuses on forest, our program focuses on expanding tree cover in agricultural systems and in changing agricultural practices so as to increase soil organic matter and hence water retention capacity while enhancing above and below ground carbon sinks. Thus, our restoration initiative is both a climate change adaptation and a climate change mitigation strategy. And it is the centerpiece of our NDCs under the Paris Accord. The Salvador Restoration Initiative is ambitious. In December 2012, at COP18, we pledged to restore 1 million hectares, equivalent to half the country's territory, contingent on international support. My successor, as Minister of the Environment, Lena Paul, lobbied internationally to declare 2021-2030 as the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. And on March last year, the UN General Assembly officially adopted that resolution. In terms of progress, in El Salvador, by the end of last year, we came close to 1/5 of the 1 million hectare restoration goal. But this was the easy part. Our real challenge is to include those areas with the greatest land degradation that are mostly occupied by degraded pastures, as well as food crops grown by peasant farmers. This requires a far more aggressive strategy and greater support from the international community. Globally, I firmly believe that the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration that officially begins next year provides an opportunity to address some of the ecological threats highlighted by the Ecological Threat Register report. And we should take full advantage of it. Thank you, Michael.
That's excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Germán. And I was especially shocked by the 6% GDP loss that you mentioned, which perhaps goes some way to answering the return on investment question that we were discussing before. In this case, of course, the potential avoidance of loss. Can you remember any particular security implications that were a result of or correlated to the impact of the hurricanes that you mentioned at the time in El Salvador?
I think that one of the things that we've seen is migration as being a key issue. We had a large out-migration during the Civil War in the 1980s, but migration has continued unimpeded. And in the last few years, most of the migrants are coming from rural areas, and here drought is a key element. In terms of security, we haven't been able to find direct links yet. And there are some indirect links now that have to do with migration, remittances, violence, feeding into each other. And remittances play a large role. Remittances have like an interesting effect. On the one hand, they have reduced overall inequality and poverty. They are the major factor in that reduction. but at the same time, they have increased inequality among the poor, between those families that are remittance recipients and those families that are not. And so this encourages some to capture through violence the remittances they lack for the same standard of living. So migration, it's like the dominating factor. In 2017, it was estimated that there were 2.3 million people of Salvadoran origin in the United States. And in El Salvador, we have like 6.4 million people. So that's about a third. And so this is like the key feature of El Salvador in socioeconomic terms, migration, remittances. But from the climate perspective, we are at a location that seems to be like a hotspot. Pacific cyclones did not come near El Salvador. Now they do. And this is not very well studied yet, but it certainly, we felt the impacts. And those impacts were so large that we were forced to respond. The landscape restoration response, I think, can be an important tool to address some of the risks that you highlight in your report, particularly water insecurity.
Excellent, thank you very much, Germán. And you bring up the topic of remittances and adding those angles. And of course, there's a fascinating study, albeit probably somber study, to be done regarding the impact of COVID-19 on remittances, because of obviously people not working, not being able to send that money back home. That's probably a conversation for another day, but certainly food for thought. So at this point, and just before going to Q&A, I'd like to open it up to panelists exclusively for any questions, comments, or follow-up items based on what we've heard today. Excellent. Okay, so we have a good line of questions. Please, everybody, do keep them coming. Question number one. This one is for Steve. You didn't mention threats in places like the US, UK, etc. Does it mean between now and 2050 there is nothing ecologically threatening in these geographical locations? Steve, you're on mute. Yeah.
Excellent. That should be much better now, Michael. So yes, look, that's an excellent question. So what we looked at was the areas with the most ecological threats. So if we look at, let's say, the US, or you look at Australia as well, you'll find that those countries are facing 3 ecological threats. Europe itself, because of where it's situated at, is many of the countries are facing what we'd see as no major ecological threats, other than the Netherlands and Belgium, which will suffer from the rising sea levels. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not going to be affected by climate change, and it doesn't mean that their environments aren't going to change. So, for example, Belgium recently was running out of water, but that's simply because they don't capture enough water. So the other thing is, with the high resilience countries, let's say like the US, Europe and Australia, they've got the capacity and the resources to adjust. So what we're trying to do in this study is isolate the countries which have the biggest threats and with the least ability to be able to adjust or have the resilience to withstand the shocks. So I think that's the major thrust of the report. But Europe, I was surprised how well it came out of it, and then obviously sort of other countries like the US, Australia just had very high adapting capabilities. That doesn't mean that they're not going to be hit with shocks, like let's say look at Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Sandy in the US, it just means that their coping capacities are much better.
So just to add, Steve, I know this wasn't exactly in the scope of your study, but one thing that's interesting too, when you get down to the actual governance level, is the sort of subnational. So within the United States, and I know you know this, there are definitely populations that are less resilient than others. And that's sort of a hidden problem within the data for governments, is how do you handle, so Katrina, for example, that the effects of Katrina hit African-American populations much more heavily, and they were much more likely to be internally displaced and not return home. So that's also, I think it's also worth keeping in mind that within the data, there sometimes are little stories underneath that resilience isn't necessarily as good as it looks at the top level.
Yes, I agree with that, Sharon and Tyler. We decided to stick at the country or nation state level. But certainly, even if you move into, let's say, countries in Africa, you'll find some of them have got more resource constraints, less water, more and higher population growth than, let's say, other areas. In the future, we'd like to dig down onto that further, just to sort of try and at a subnational level. But when you've got to, let's say in this study, 157 countries, it gets really hard getting down to that level of detail.
No, I think it's awesome. It's just I wouldn't want my fellow Americans to think they're off the hook.
Yeah, could I?
Please, Claudia, of course.
Thank you. No, I was also struck to see sort of the vision for Latin America. And if you see the resilience of the world, you have big ecological threats to ecosystems like the Amazon. So when you sort of point these in a country level without looking to the ecological threats in general of the main ecosystems of the world, you sort of underpin, as Sharon says, sort of the need to understand these resilience. Unless we protect, for example, the Amazon, we won't be able to have water. And that in Colombia will obviously affect the communities, the livelihoods, etc., which in fact will affect, for example, the conflict. So I think there are bigger relationships when you see these at the ecosystem level in general and the resilience of the world with other factors. And I also think that in terms of climate change, well, obviously you can affect and you can say that climate change affects water, but it also affects every aspect of the livelihoods of the world. So I think there is a bigger connection between climate change and conflict than we are thinking. And we need to sort of rethink the way forward, because I would love to see sort of the responses from that report in terms of what is the vision of change once that we know that there is a relationship, no? And I think that's the next step based on your report. I mean, how could we tackle this? I'm part of, for example, the Green Climate Fund. I've been assessing the projects of climate change in the world. I have never seen, I have assessed 360 projects already, the relationship with the conflict. And I think we should put it in. So there is somehow it is not connected, no?
Thanks for that, Claudia. Two comments I'd make. A lot of the people can see these ecological threats as being related to climate change, but they particularly the resource ones, they stand independent of climate change. They're going to be there with or without it. Climate change will exaggerate the effects, but the reality is we are consuming water faster than we're actually capturing it, and there isn't a lot left in a lot of countries. And food production also, we can see that is also we're also, the consumption of food is fast outstripping our ability to be able to grow it. So these issues are going to be there either way. And so if we look at it, most countries are reducing their overseas developmental aid. So like the US, I think, is down 40%, Italy's down 18%, none of the European countries have actually increased their overseas developmental aid in the last 5 years, including Sweden and Norway. So the solutions to this have to come from somewhere else. And a lot of the time we tend to fall back on government, saying it's up to governments to help. But for me, I think there's a whole, and if we look at food, food's a byproduct of water. So for me, what mechanisms are out there to be able to stimulate micro water businesses? How can we capture water better? And then what is the economics of actually taking that water and then developing micro businesses? And obviously the obvious one's agriculture. For me, we can actually tackle that one. You can get business involved, and then you've got a virtuous cycle of people investing to make money to solve these problems. Just another point on that, Herman's comments on the tree cover in El Salvador. Niger, for example, is the only country in the world increasing its coverage of the foliage in the world, and it's been using a technique called FMNR, which farmer managed natural regeneration. They've been using that with the pastoralists in the country, and it's a technique which you could adopt across Africa, which would massively increase the coverage and the capture of water. So I think there are techniques out there, but like we haven't got enough around the economic models and how to actually scale them, so they're self-scaling off the benefits which they give rather than relying on governments to come in with aid.
That's excellent. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And actually, following up on that, Germán, when we talked, you said, what was it you said? You like welcomed, El Salvador being used as sort of a lab, essentially, for resilience building efforts, and you thought that it could be an extremely good case study given its size, its population, and its current situation, as well as its need. Steve was talking about micro water projects. You were talking about landscape projects previously. What would be the next sort of resilience building, countrywide resilience building initiative that you would welcome or propose for El Salvador specifically? If you could just unmute yourself, Germán. Thank you. And I can actually unmute.
Yeah, sorry about that. I think rather than putting together a new initiative, the thing is our challenge is to sustain the effort. What's interesting about this landscape restoration initiative is that it's probably one of the few policies that has had continuity over 3 governments. We started it, then the next government where Lina Paul was minister continued with that offer and upscaled it. And the current minister is also supportive of this and has indeed presented a Central American initiative along the same lines. No? I think we have there is a lot of accumulation in technical terms. We've had fantastic support from IUCN, WRI, and other parts to put this together. There is a monitoring system in place. So what is the challenge? So far, we've advanced with the easy pickings. But those areas where you have the greatest land degradation, where rural poverty concentrates, where people are migrating from due to extreme water insecurity, those areas require like another level of effort because the benefits do not come quickly. And therefore you have to sustain an effort over a long time. And here we have a very good example. The Howard Buffett Foundation is supporting CRS, Catholic Relief Services, and Caritas on a restoration initiative in an area in the western part of the country. And the foundation has committed funding over 12 years. And this is the kind of thing you need to do, because most projects, by the time they start learning, the funding dries up. You cannot do this with 3, 4, 5-year projects. You need to commit for a long time. And in that way, people will respond, because otherwise people see this thing as fads and they don't really get engaged because there are some risks involved. And so they rather continue doing things as usual. So going back to your question on insecurity, I tackle it from the angle of violence. But I think in their report, you stress water insecurity, which I think is probably the most significant issue that affects many countries. And in the case of tropical countries, you have to be careful, because when you look at year averages, the water insecurity does not appear. El Salvador, well, Colombia, according to FAO stats, Aquastat, sorry, has the largest precipitation in the world. El Salvador has half the precipitation of Colombia, so it's not a precipitation is not the problem. The problem is yearly, when you look at it along the year, in the driest 3 months, you only get less than 10% of annual precipitation. Sorry, 2%. And then during the wet season, we have dry spells. And in 2018, in a part of the country, the dry spell lasted for 40 days, which was an all-time record. And of course, there is no way crops can survive on those conditions. So I think El Salvador is, because of its size, but also because of the ecological diversity, it provides like at a small case, allows you to highlight many of these issues, no? Including migration, violence. We have to remember that El Salvador is still the country with the highest homicide rate in the world, larger than Colombia. And so you have all these issues coming together, violence, migration, remittance-driven economy with huge impacts on society, large impacts of extreme weather events, both extreme precipitation and also drought, and the unresolved issues of development. And one of the things that I think we learned from our peace accords, which were groundbreaking because it was the first time the UN Security Council supported mediation in an internal conflict, was that the kind of bargains that you make on those agreements have consequences. Development issues were left aside on those accords. And now we pay the price. And so we cannot see this like in isolation, no? Obviously, another challenge is how we link up this landscape restoration effort to employment generation, to reduction of violence and insecurity, and so on. And there are ways to do this. But I think this requires like a different level of engagement also by the international community.
Thank you very much, Germán. That kind of sort of really brought it all together, and also made me feel that let's talk about something different. Let's up the mood. Let's talk about less security, less security related. And let's talk about how we can fix this concretely. And there was a specific question here, actually one that gets us on that way, which is from Richard Jordan from NYC, the International Council for Caring Communities. Question for Steve. Clarification, how do you define well-being as mentioned in one of the slides? You just need to unmute yourself, Steve.
Thanks, Michael. Second time I've forgotten to do that. Yeah, no, good question, Richard. So I think what we do is there's a number of different indexes out there which would measure well-being and happiness. There's about 4 or 5 of them. What we do is we take a positive, well, I'll come back to positive peace and the Global Peace Index. So we've got Global Peace Index, which ranks 99.7% of the world's population according to its peacefulness by country. What we do then, we've got about 25,000 different data sets, indexes, attitudinal surveys. So we use statistical analysis to work out the factors which are most closely associated with highly peaceful societies. We then use other statistical factors to clump them into sort of these 8 domains, which we call the pillars of positive peace. Then we bring that back into another index, which we call the Positive Peace Index. And the power of that means we can see whether countries are improving or deteriorating in their levels of positive peace. And that then byproduct of that's resilience. So what we do then is we take that, compare it, this index, and do statistical analysis against a whole lot of other things to see what correlates. And there's about 4 or 5 different indexes which measure well-being or happiness. And they come out with a reasonably high statistically strong correlation. From memory, it's sort of about points. The R factor is about 0.6.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, Steve. And there's a couple of questions back to security again. So we are gonna have to return to that. But just before we do, there's a nice one here which kind of sort of is somewhat philosophical, but also really gets to the crux of the matter. Is it possible to take the action needed in the time frames projected to do what needs to be done to truly mitigate the grave existential risk we face now with climate change without global command of economics and authoritative governance with the power to distribute, I'm assuming it may mean food here, or our needs in a long-term sustainable way, equally on a needs basis? So I'd actually like to open that up to, starting with you, Steve, and then opening that up to the panel.
Sure. Okay, look. It's an excellent question. So the question isn't will we be able to solve it all, or it's a question of how can we make things better from where they are. I don't think we're going to stop, or we're not going to stop all wars. Wars have been going on all last century, all the beginning part of this century. The question is sort of how can we mitigate the future effects. And I'll come back to basically where I started off before, and it's what we're really got to do is work out how do you get to, and I guess this comes back a bit to the systems thinking. How can you kickstart the systems so they're on a virtuous cycle of improvement and continual improvement? And the way to do it around this is, I think, picking up on some of Sharon's stuff, it's around better governance in a lot of these countries because the governance is really, really poor. But for me, it's really about how can you find business solutions to these things. Population, the 17 countries with the over 100% increase in population, how do we actually get better ways of being able to get the people themselves involved in not wanting to have so many children? How can you go about doing that? So I think these are all really important. I'll go right out on a limb here on this one. I think in many ways, I think we are going to solve our CO2 emissions. If you look at just the increased power of solar panels, the increased ability of batteries to be able to store it. If you look at the cars, the way cars are all going electric, a decade from now, 15 years from now, there'll hardly be any non-electric cars left. So I think, I honestly, in my head, I can see how we can get on top of CO2 emissions. But a lot of the other sustainability issues, some of the things Claudia's mentioned, for example, and particularly water and food, I think we need, these are the things which truly worry me going forward into the future. And I think the solutions have got to involve business. Governments just haven't got the money to throw in. But what can happen is we can really support governments to try and improve the way their governance and a lot of the other factors which revolve around positive peace. So if we can improve those factors, you're now creating underlying conditions for the societies to actually solve their own problems. So it's a couple of quick thoughts there, Michael.
Excellent, thank you. I'd like to open it up to anybody else.
Yeah, I do believe that a better future is possible, but I do believe that we have to shift the way we do things. We need to sort of start working in a more integral fashion. We need to look, for example, ministers of environment relating to ministers of agriculture and ministers of health, and see the linkages between all these angles. I think there is also a need to sort of see that what we do in the next 10 years, what will shape the world. And right now, in the next year, as you all know, we have the Glasgow COP, where all the countries need to sort of relay into their commitments to the Paris Agreement. We also have a Food Systems Summit in Rome next year, and it's crucial. And what is happening is that they're forging something that is called champions of food systems. I'm actually a champion of food systems, but what they want is to the world to think that they're also champions of food systems. And unless we move towards thinking that everybody can do a little change, we cannot move the world. So I think championing this issue is crucial. And then in terms of biodiversity, we have the COP of biodiversity in China also next year. So we have three crucial COPs, no? The biodiversity, climate change, and food systems. And I think we need to relate them all. And we need the countries to move into policies that really integrate the need to move faster and to sort of achieve something that is possible. I already told you about the transitions that we're envisioning with FOLU, and we really have sort of the economic estimates that a better future is possible and what it achieves in terms of economic sort of alternatives. So I think we should, really drive this conversation into the better future, into the better world.
Thank you, Claudia. Something that you mentioned, you talked about championing the issue. One of the results of some of the conversations that we've been having before and during the release of the Ecological Threat Register with a number of groups was that yes, absolutely championing the issue, but equally importantly, identifying the champions at local, municipal and federal level. That individual person who can kind of sort of take up the mantra. And kind of sort of, has the experience, the ability, the character and capacity to be able to kind of sort of drive things forward. Because obviously it's in many occasions the individual that end up, pushing a lot of these things forward nationally. Yeah,
we need to drive behavioral change. And as you say, for example, in the case of FOLU Colombia, we're seeing that at the territorial level, all this integration makes better sense. Because we see departments and municipalities that have been more in conflict. We see the hotspots of biodiversity, and we also see that they have very low livelihoods. And obviously we need to sort of move towards imagining who are the leaders in those regions, who can drive their own changes, but really make them part of the solution and not only part of the risk or of the problem.
That's great, Claudia. Thank you. And talking about champions or leaders or individuals that can obviously make a large difference. And this is in relation to a couple of questions here on the Q&A, which, if it's okay with the person asking them, I'm going to paraphrase. But it will be a question for Sharon and the current priorities of the U.S. administration. You talked about, the America first. The questions largely revolve around, what do we deem to be the near close term impact in terms of conflict with regards to America's country position, both internally, but also specifically with regards to relations with China, for example?
Well, I think, you know, to kludge it together with the previous question too, when you say, is it all possible to succeed? Well, what's the alternative? You know, it's not even worth asking the question that way, because we will succeed. We have to succeed. And I think there's lots of evidence that things can be done. And on some level in my own country, the positive peace initiatives continue no matter what's happening in the White House. So for example, America's investment in water management in other countries, in developing countries, continues. That a lot of those priorities haven't changed, no matter what the rhetoric sounds like. On the other hand, I'm very concerned about where the United States, what the United States looks like on your index next time. You know, we're seeing some very concerning trends in the United States that those of us who have worked in foreign policy are used to seeing in other countries. And I am very concerned about the disintegration of our own civic life and the rise of civic violence. And that coupled with some of the ecological threats that are happening here. And it's a reminder, but even that you can spin into a positive story, which is a reminder that leadership makes a difference and leadership matters. And that as fast as things can degrade, they can also improve. And I think Colombia is an interesting case for that as well. So I don't feel confident about where my country is right now, but I also feel like there's a great deal of reason to hope. If the current administration continues for a second term, I think that'll be disastrous, not just for the United States, but for the role that my country plays internationally in building positive peace, and also for what happens between the United States and China going forward. So thanks, Mark. That's a nice comment on there.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, Sharon, for talking very eloquently on a very sensitive but important subject. Steve, shifting continents, in the ETR, the Sahel is identified as a region highly susceptible to ecological collapse. How soon will we see this, and how will it affect levels of conflict we're already seeing in the region?
So it's very difficult to actually go out and put a date on events which would create an ecological collapse, because droughts, get 100-year droughts coming up. These will get more effective. These will get to picking the year when you're going to have one gets very, very difficult. But they're the kind of things which create tipping points, or once in 100-year floods. But what I would say is we've already seen the effects of it. We've probably been seeing the effects of it for 50 years. We just haven't really been looking clearly at it. We can certainly see the Lake Chad, it's down to 10% water capacity it had 20 years ago. And you can see that the conflicts which have fueled up around that area, we're seeing rising, let's say in Mali, for example, or Chad, you're seeing rising, or Niger, rising Islamist movements there, sort of just modelling themselves, let's say, on ISIS or Al-Qaeda or groups like that. You can move into, let's say, Nigeria, and you're seeing the conflicts there between the pastoralists and the herders, particularly between the Fulani and settlers. So it's all, these conflicts are already there, okay? They're already there. But they are only going to get worse without really being able to change the situation and really start to address some of these areas. And I'll use resilience in its very broadest sense here. So that's there. But you do have tipping points, and the tipping points usually come about because of an event. So things keep along on a particular path. tipping point, it can be a minor event sometimes, but that's enough to actually radically change a system. So where you did have a government which was, let's say, fragile, did have control of territory, you'll get an event, and it can be like Haiti, a catastrophic event, or it can be just a number of very, very small events. One's enough to tip the system. Let's say like Tunisia with the Arab Spring and the street vendor setting himself on fire. So it's difficult. It's really difficult. But we can say it's there now. It has been there for quite a while, and it's progressively getting worse.
That's great, Steve. Thank you. And you know, one of the things that you mentioned brought me back to a comment that Claudia made earlier, which I'd actually like to ask you a tiny bit more about, Claudia. You mentioned you were talking about tipping points, Steve, and you know, those are negative tipping points, but obviously the signing of the Colombia Peace Accord is a positive tipping point for the most part. But you also mentioned something related to, I believe it was illegal logging or deforestation, and how that sort of interacted with the signing of the Peace Accord, either before or after. Claudia, could you expand a tiny bit on that, since it was just such a concrete example?
Sure. What happened is that during many years of conflict in Colombia, the guerrillas and the paramilitaries were sort of, you know, protecting, in a sense, nature, because they were not allowing people to get in, basically. So what happened is like that some of the ecosystems, and like the Amazon, was sort of even restored, and people were afraid of going into those areas. But obviously, and that's when I say that, you know, sometimes the conflict sort of helped, in a sense, nature, not to the extent, because as soon as they signed the peace agreement, what happened is that people were able to go to those areas. And the first thing they did was deforest to put, for example, cows. And there was, you know, sort of a lack of governance, a lack of institutions. And so if you see after 2016, deforestation went up, until, you know, the Colombian government was able to have more control, the local governments were able to have more control. Now, obviously, you see the reverse side of that, because, you know, what is happening is through illegal drugs, or, for example, in taking all the natural resources, speaking about gold and even sort of petroleum and all the other resources that Colombia has, illegality was rampant, and was rampant basically because there is a connection between conflict and illegal type of activities. And so we had both versions of the conflict, you know, one that was good for nature, the other one that was outrageous for nature. And but we have to face them both, and we have to see the vision of change. And as we're sort of forging now through the Truth Commission, is the non-repetition. What were those connections that happened during so many years that we need not to repeat, and that affected not only ecosystems, but ecosystems with societies, because people were displaced, because people had no other sources of support. And so there's, you know, lots of connections going in understanding what happened in these 50 years of conflict in Colombia. What is interesting is that the Truth Commission didn't have nature as part of their mandates. And now that they're hearing the voices of many Colombians, they obviously are seeing that nature and the environment has a lot to do with conflict, and they're able to put it in the report that they have to produce for next year.
Excellent, thank you, Claudia. That was an absolutely fascinating example, and it just goes to show how much needs to be unpacked. I mean, of course, you know, the Ecological Threat Register has its value because it has it focuses globally, but using that as the basis, being able to drill down on specific regions, on specific countries, using similar methodologies to be able to sort of outline this with so much granularity, and identifying cases like this, I think could be a tremendously productive exercise. I'd like to ask my final question to Germán, and I'd like to kind of sort of bring it full circle in terms of how the conversation started, specifically multilateral cooperation in the face of future ecological threats. Now, El Salvador is one of the smaller countries in Central America. So I was wondering if you could speak to the current status with regards to collaboration with other countries in Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, etc., Costa Rica, with regards to countering future ecological threats. What platforms are there, and what are the key sort of lessons learned that can be learned from them?
We will be facing another type of resource scarcity, which is funding, both internal and external. I mean, the way the countries are responding this is leading to increasing debt. Public debt has increased tremendously just this year. And most of it is short-term debt, which means that interest payments will skyrocket. So the fiscal space to carry out this type of initiative will shrink, but also external cooperation. So I think the challenge we face is, and I think Claudia touched on this, is how we work in an integrated way. This is very easily said, but any of us who have worked in government know, or in international cooperation, knows how the silo mentality is so entrenched. I think in the face of scarce resources, we have to look for synergies. And I think that is the key operating words. Synergies between adaptation and mitigations, synergies with peace-building efforts and tackling insecurity, synergies to strengthen food systems. And I think this is the kind of platforms that we need, is those that allows for effective synergies. Because if we're going to have much less resources, we have to make the most of it, or what we will be able to mobilize. Otherwise, I think we'll backtrack and we will continue to lose ground on many areas. And I think if this forces us, this scarcity forces us to work in a more integrated way, I think that would be a huge step forward.
That is excellent. Thank you very much, Germán, for those closing remarks, which I do think bring it all together so well. And with that, I'd like to draw a close to the end of this session. I'd like to thank UN 75 Global Governance Forum and all of the people behind the scenes for making this happen. Our esteemed guests today, thank you so much for your contributions. And most importantly of all, everybody who attended the session today. It's greatly appreciated, and we look forward to many more of these discussions in the near future. Once again, thank you very much. Look forward to seeing you all again very soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Take care down under.
Okay, I certainly will, Richard. I hope you enjoyed it.
Very much. We'll send it out to the world tonight via the daily recap.
Great. Okay, and we'll pick up another conversation another 4 weeks or so, eh? Just wait for all this part to settle down.
Yeah, we're planning stuff for UN Day. In fact, October 24th, we must get you involved in the program with the Alliance for Multilateralism.
Yeah, it sounds good. Sounds good to me. Sounds good to me. I think.
Thanks again. It's the beginning of your day. Your day has started with us. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I've got about a 6-hour strategy session with one of my companies today. So that's where most of the time's going to go on Zoom. So it's going to be boring.
Wonderful. Take care. Thanks again.
Thanks, Richard.
We'll send out updates soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.